She said, "People like him don't sit here." And 2 rows behind her, Keanu Reeves quietly stood up. No cameras, no script, just a man defending another in the silence of a moving train. By the time the wheels stopped, the entire room would never be the same. What made him rise that day? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The late afternoon sun slanted through the iron arches of Grand Central Terminal, casting long golden streaks across the marble floor. Everything seemed to move in quiet rhythm. The shuffle of polished shoes, the hum of rolling luggage, the distant rumble of arriving trains. But on track 7, something different waited. It shimmered in the amber light like a relic from another era, a train unlike any other. The Silver Horizon. It wasn't just transportation. It was history on rails, a symbol of elegance carved into chrome and velvet, a moving monument to a time when travel was an art form, not a chore. Its name glinted off the polished siding as if daring the world to forget the grace it once knew. Few had the privilege of stepping aboard. Even fewer understood the weight of that privilege. Among the crowd, unnoticed and unaccompanied, walked Morgan Freeman. He wore a thick charcoal overcoat with the collar turned slightly up. A soft scarf was looped neatly around his neck, and a modest hat shaded his eyes. In his left hand, he carried a simple, well-worn leather bag. In his right, a gold-edged train pass lifetime, embossed with initials and a seal no one questioned. He moved with a quiet grace that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it anyway. A young porter spotted him near the ticket gate and rushed over. "Sir, may I take your bag?" Morgan stopped. He looked the boy in the eye, his expression calm and warm. "No, thank you," he said, gently. "I've carried it this far." The porter hesitated, then nodded, sensing the boundary wasn't disrespect, it was dignity. Morgan nodded once in return and turned toward the gleaming steps of the Silver Horizon. To most, it looked like just another man boarding a train. But to those paying attention, there was something deeper at work. The quiet authority of someone who had learned not to ask for a seat at the table because he had spent his life building his own. He passed through the brass-edged entrance and into the heart of the Alien car. This wasn't just any cabin. The Alien car was the crown jewel of the Silver Horizon, reserved for dignitaries, legacy donors, private financiers, and select cultural icons. Inside, everything spoke of old money and inherited power. Cedar panels framed the windows. Velvet-lined chairs rested under soft Art Deco lighting. The smell of aged scotch, leather-bound menus, and polished wood filled the air. Conversations here weren't loud. They were measured, strategic. Deals that shaped companies and reputations had been inked over its linen-covered tables. No one raised their voice. No one raised suspicion. Morgan Freeman paused at the entrance for only a moment. Then he moved forward, as if he belonged. Because he did. His steps were soft, each one tapping against the herringbone floor with quiet confidence. He didn't look left or right. He didn't need to. His seat was already printed on the card in his hand. Row 3. Window. Just the way he liked it. Morgan reached his seat and paused for a breath. He set his bag down gently, then removed his coat with careful, practiced movements. He folded it neatly and placed it on the seat beside him. From the inner pocket of the coat, he pulled out a small leather journal, its corners softened with time, and laid it on the tray table before him. Then, finally, Saturday. The seat embraced him like it remembered him. The sun from the window brushed the side of his face, illuminating the faint silver in his beard. He exhaled slowly, not out of fatigue, but as though acknowledging that even peace, when earned, carried its own weight. He glanced at the journal, his fingers tracing the spine. Then he turned toward the window, watching the light shift over the platform as other passengers filed in. He didn't rush to write. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The train had not yet moved, but something already had. Behind him, a steward in a crisp charcoal vest and white gloves moved quietly between rows. He nodded politely at each guest, offering assistance with coats and champagne flutes. His movements were precise, rehearsed, nearly invisible. He reached Morgan's row and paused, unsure whether to interrupt. Morgan turned, nodded once, and the steward gave a slight bow before continuing on. Across the aisle, someone else had noticed the man in row 3. Regina Whitmore sat upright, her chin poised just above her silver scarf. She had arrived nearly 20 minutes earlier and had already arranged her belongings to her liking. A crystal flute rested delicately between her fingers, the reflection of the chandeliers dancing inside the pale gold liquid. She hadn't spoken much yet, but her presence radiated in waves, like perfume diffusing across a parlor. And now, her attention fixed on Morgan. She said nothing, but her narrowed gaze spoke volumes. It was the gaze of someone who had curated a world and didn't appreciate unfamiliar brushstrokes appearing on her canvas. She watched the way Morgan moved without apology, without effort, and something in her resisted it. To Regina, this car was a mirror of legacy, of boundaries honored and names recognized. She had grown up believing that luxury wasn't about wealth, it was about knowing your place and knowing when someone else didn't. And across the aisle, Morgan Freeman, with his quiet calm and journal, didn't seem to fit the script she had memorized since girlhood. She sipped her champagne and tilted her head, calculating, curious. Toward the back of the car, near the last row by the window, Keanu Reeves sat in near stillness. A battered copy of The Brothers Karamazov rested in his lap. His black shirt was slightly wrinkled. His boots were scuffed, his hair unbrushed. He looked more like a traveler from another time than a passenger on a luxury train. But he noticed everything. His eyes flicked to Morgan, then to Regina, then back to the page. Outside, the conductor blew his whistle. The Silver Horizon lurched forward. The Silver Horizon pulled away from Grand Central with the subtle power of something that knew its own worth. The polished wheels met the rails with a smooth, rhythmic grace, as if even the metal had been trained to move with dignity. Inside the alien car, there was no clatter, no rush, only the quiet murmur of legacy brushing against velvet and crystal. Morgan leaned back slightly, adjusting his scarf. The hum of the train filled the space around him, a soft companion to his silence. The journal remained closed. He wasn't ready to write yet. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood the value of waiting for the right words. A waiter passed by offering Bordeaux. Morgan declined with a nod, preferring stillness over indulgence. His eyes returned to the window. The city slipped by, in golden reflections, glass, brick, shadow. He watched it not with detachment, but with recognition. He had seen it all before. He had walked these streets, voiced its stories, carried its silences, and now he moved through it like mist. Regina Whitmore hadn't looked away. She swirled her champagne idly, watching him with the precision of someone trained to notice what didn't belong. Her posture remained impeccable, but her thoughts fidgeted just beneath the surface. She leaned slightly toward her left, toward the man seated beside her, a hedge fund partner who had already begun flipping through. A private financial report. "Jameson," she whispered. The steward, stationed halfway up the aisle, turned at the sound of his name. He approached promptly, heels soundless against the wood. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked, bowing slightly. Regina offered a delicate smile, the kind that masked sharp edges. "Could you double-check the seating manifest? There may have been a small oversight. That gentleman," she gestured vaguely toward Morgan with the tilt of her glass. "Is he assigned to this car?" Jameson blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Yes, ma'am. All seating was confirmed by the central manifest this morning." She lowered her voice just enough to remain audible but private. "I'm sure it's nothing, but the legacy car has always maintained a certain consistency. Donors, diplomats, former governors. I don't mean to raise alarm, of course. Just curiosity." Jameson hesitated. He didn't want to ask. Something in his bones warned him, but protocol pulled him forward. Across the aisle, Morgan turned slowly. He hadn't been looking at them, but he had heard everything. Jameson approached with cautious humility, clutching a tablet that displayed the passenger list. "Sir, forgive me. Would you mind verifying your pass? Just a clerical check, I assure you." Morgan reached into his coat without a word and produced the gold-trimmed pass. The steward accepted it and scanned the embedded chip. A soft beep confirmed its authenticity. His eyes widened. Not only was it valid, it was more than that. Morgan Freeman wasn't just a passenger. He held a lifetime designation issued by the National Rail Preservation Trust, something only a handful of living individuals possessed. Jameson's throat tightened. "Everything is in perfect order, sir." The alien car drifted forward as the city behind it blurred into streaks of steel and glass. Inside, the air was cool, crisp, and filled with a kind of cultivated silence. Jazz trickled softly from hidden speakers, barely audible beneath the quiet rhythm of conversation and the gentle clink of glass on porcelain. Velvet chairs stood like sentinels in perfect alignment beneath warm sconces. The scent of cedar wood mingled with aged liquor and something fainter, maybe perfume, maybe pride. It was a cabin designed not just for travel, but for legacy. Each passenger wore their wealth like a second skin. Italian wool suits, silk scarves, polished cufflinks, and heirloom brooches. They did not lounge. They curated posture. Their conversations weren't loud, but they carried weight tax strategy, art auctions, rumors from the political coastlines. Power was the native language of the alien car, and everyone spoke it fluently, but not everyone saw. Most of the passengers glanced at Morgan Freeman only once, if at all. A passing look, a polite nod. Some didn't recognize him. Others weren't sure where to place him. A man of presence, yes, but wrapped in too much restraint, too little flash. He did not announce himself. He did not beg for notice. In this room, that made him invisible. Regina Whitmore noticed. She always did. Her father used to say that a Whitmore could scan a room the way a jeweler studies diamonds, spotting cracks no one else sees. And she had inherited that sharpness in full. Her pale blue eyes, magnified slightly by jeweled glasses, flicked from face to face like a scanner tracking for irregularities. And Morgan was an irregularity. There was nothing offensive in his appearance. Quite the opposite. He was composed, neat. He moved like someone who respected time. But to Regina, that wasn't enough. Appearance in her world was a language, and he didn't speak it the way she'd been taught to hear. She watched the way he declined champagne, the way he opened his journal instead of a portfolio. She noticed his silence. That was the most suspicious thing of all. People in the alien car weren't quiet. They were measured. They played the game of conversation like fencing tip, parry, posture. But Morgan Freeman sat with the confidence of a man who didn't need to prove he belonged. That unsettled her. She tilted her head slightly and took another sip from her crystal flute. In the very back row, Keanu Reeves watched from behind the cover of his book. He didn't turn pages often. He didn't need to. He had read The Brothers Karamazov enough times to know every chapter by heart, but it gave him something to hold, something that made people ignore him. And that was what he wanted. His hoodie was dark and loose. His jeans worn at the knees. His boots had seen more train platforms than runways. He didn't move like a celebrity. He didn't move like a rebel. He moved like a man who had spent years perfecting the art of going unnoticed in plain sight. But he was paying attention to everything. Keanu's gaze slid from the words on the page to the interactions around him, subtle but intentional. A glance here, a shoulder turn there. In a room like this, disrespect didn't arrive in shouts. It came in silk-lined whispers and champagne-covered smirks. It came in the way people nodded just enough to be polite, but not enough to invite connection. And Regina was performing. Her movements were not just about comfort. They were orchestration. The way she adjusted her scarf to catch the light. The way she laughed, just loudly enough for others to hear, even when no one had spoken to her. She wasn't just riding a train, she was holding court. She didn't address Morgan directly, not yet. That would have been too forward, too obvious. Instead, she commented on the upholstery, on the change in menu, on how she missed the old pastry chef from last season's route. But every word was wrapped around one message. This place belongs to people like me. She glanced once more at Morgan, then lowered her voice to the man beside her. Didn't this car used to feel more curated? She asked. The man grunted in vague agreement, not looking up from his tablet. She smiled, pleased enough with herself. Keanu closed the book softly in his lap and rested his hand over the cover. His eyes drifted to Morgan's row. He could see the man's stillness, not the kind born from discomfort, but the kind built through years of enduring rooms just like this one. The kind of stillness a man learned after being told without words that his presence was too much for some and too little for others. Morgan hadn't flinched once. He hadn't looked over. He hadn't responded. But Keanu could see it. The way his shoulders rested just an inch deeper into the seat now. The way his journal remained closed, as if even his thoughts didn't deserve interruption. The way his left hand rested against his thigh, fingers curling once, just once, before going still again. That was all it took. Keanu had seen enough. The train continued west, leaving behind the stone and steel skeleton of Manhattan. Outside, the Hudson River flickered in the distance. Inside, the passengers dined on foie gras and vintage wines, spoke in low tones about mergers, theater openings, foundation dinners, and Morgan Freeman remained a ghost in the periphery of their eyes. A man who had narrated presidents, played gods, lent his voice to history, now treated like an afterthought in a room that claimed to honor legacy. Regina's lips curled as she whispered again to the steward, just loud enough to reach the seats nearby. "Jameson, darling, can you confirm the manifest once more? I'd hate for there to have been a ticketing glitch." This time, Morgan looked up. He didn't speak. His gaze was calm, focused, steady. It landed on Regina for less than a second. Just enough to say everything he didn't need to voice. And then he looked away. Keanu leaned back, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Jameson returned a moment later, hands clasped behind his back, his face now carefully neutral. He had checked again. He had read the fine print. He had seen the seal. But more than that, he had remembered. He remembered a fundraising gala 2 years prior, a black tie event hosted at the National Rail Museum. Morgan Freeman had stood quietly at the back that night too, offering no speech, just a check. One that helped restore this very car. But he said none of that. Instead, he bowed slightly and said, "All in order, ma'am. Mr. Freeman is exactly where he should be." Regina blinked, her lashes fluttering just once. She gave a tight-lipped smile, the kind that curved without warmth. "Oh, how lovely," she replied. "One of those honorary things, then. So moving." Keanu's fingers, resting on the cover of his book, curled slightly into a fist. The room didn't feel angry. It didn't feel loud. But it was charged like air before a thunderstorm, like breath held too long. Morgan didn't flinch. He turned back toward the window, his posture unchanged, his face unreadable. His presence remained what it had always been, quiet, earned, and unmoved by small people in tall chairs. But Regina wasn't finished. She leaned toward her table-mate and murmured, "Grace is fading in public spaces. People dress down, speak loud, and forget the art of refinement. I suppose we're meant to feel grateful just to share the space." Keanu didn't look at her. Not yet, but he felt it building. The way moments like this always did, layer by layer, cut by cut, until something broke. Across the aisle, Morgan reached into his coat, again, not for a ticket or a defense, but for a pen. He opened his journal, flipped to a blank page, and began to write. His script was slow, deliberate, sloping gently like a man thinking between each word. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Regina noticed, and that made her uneasy. She watched the way he refused to react, the way he held his dignity like a shield crafted from silence. To a woman like her, silence was an invitation to escalate. She shifted in her seat, letting her shawl fall slightly from her shoulder. Her fingers twirled the stem of her glass as she spoke louder now, letting her words spread like smoke. Elegance used to mean exclusivity, not this open-seating experiment in diversity, she said with a sugar-coated laugh. No one at her table challenged her. That was how it always worked. Morgan's pen continued to move. Keanu stared down at his book. The title on the spine had faded with time. The edge of the page rested against his thumb, unmoved. But inside him, something shifted. Not rage, not protest, just a decision. a slow, rising resolve that made its way to his chest and stayed there. The kind of stillness that comes before someone stands up. The kind of stillness that changes everything. The train had settled into its rhythm, a soft glide across the iron bones of the northeast corridor. Candlelight flickered gently in the Allian car, casting warm reflections on wine glasses and gold cufflinks. Passengers leaned into conversation. Laughter, muffled by velvet walls, drifted from the forward section. But amid all the warmth, a new cold had entered. It came not from the air, but from a woman's voice. Regina Whitmore leaned slightly into the aisle, just enough to be noticed, just enough to make it look like she wasn't trying. "Jameson," she said lightly, her tone wrapped in silk. The steward was a few rows away, placing a fresh napkin beside an elderly gentleman's plate. He turned at once, bowing his head. "Yes, ma'am?" She smiled, and anyone who knew her would have recognized it. It was her polished smile, the one she used at fundraisers, at board meetings, at luncheons where someone needed to be corrected without knowing they'd been. "I believe there may have been a small mix-up," she said softly, but not too softly. "The gentleman across the aisle." She glanced at Morgan, then away, as though eye contact was too generous. "He may have been placed in the wrong car." Jameson blinked. He glanced at Morgan, who sat still, a pen in hand, his journal half open. He hadn't looked up. He didn't need to. Every word had landed exactly where she wanted it to. Regina's voice dropped just enough to carry to the nearest tables. "This is the legacy section, dear," she added, sipping from her crystal flute. "I know clerical errors happen. These systems aren't perfect." She said it like a kindness, like she was helping, like her concern was for the staff, not the discomfort of sharing space with someone she had already deemed out of place. Jameson's throat worked to form a response. Morgan did not move. Keanu, at the back, lowered his eyes to the closed book in his lap. His thumb tapped the spine once. He didn't shift. He didn't rise. But something behind his stillness deepened. Jameson stepped forward. His shoes made no sound on the cedar floor, but his presence felt heavier now. He reached Morgan's row and paused beside the seat. "Sir," he began, voice soft, "would you mind terribly just confirming your boarding pass again? I know it's a minor formality, likely just an oversight on the manifest." Morgan looked up, not irritated, not surprised, just quiet. And then, with deliberate calm, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He removed a slim, gold-trimmed ticket. It caught the light as he handed it to Jameson. The steward took it gently, his hands respectful, his eyes already apologizing. Then he saw the seal, the embossed emblem of the National Rail Preservation Trust, lifetime patron, verified. Irrefutable. Jameson exhaled slowly and stood a bit straighter. He read the details again, slower this time, as if understanding the depth of what he held. This wasn't just a ticket. It was recognition forged in legacy. The kind of designation reserved for a handful of names, people who had contributed not just money, but meaning. Morgan Freeman wasn't a passenger by chance. He was one of the reasons the Allian car existed at all. Jameson glanced toward Regina. Her eyes were expectant, half-lidded, ready to receive affirmation that her suspicions had been validated. Instead, what she received was silence. Jameson cleared his throat, not because it was needed, but because it gave him a second to gather his composure. "Thank you, sir," he said, returning the pass to Morgan with both hands. "Everything is perfectly in order." Morgan accepted it with a nod. He didn't ask what had prompted the question. He didn't demand an apology. He simply placed the pass back in his coat, closed his journal, and folded his hands in his lap. Regina's smile didn't falter, not entirely, but something behind her eyes shifted. She tilted her head, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "Ah," she said. "So it was honorary then?" Jameson hesitated. That wasn't what he had said. But the way she framed it, the way she injected that single word honorary, it transformed truth into something patronizing. As if Morgan's presence was a gift from the system, not something he had earned. "Quite moving," she added, her voice syrupy. I do admire when institutions extend kindness like that. It's very modern. Morgan said nothing. He looked back toward the window. The journal remained shut. The pen rested on top. And in that small, quiet refusal to respond, there was something powerful. Keanu hadn't moved, but his eyes lifted, just for a moment. He didn't look at Regina. He looked at Morgan. And in that stillness, a silent conversation passed between them. A recognition. Outside, the scenery shifted. The skyline of New York fell away, replaced by wooded edges and the soft blue haze of the Hudson River beyond. The train pressed onward, elegant and effortless, as if nothing had happened. But something had. Not a fight, not a confrontation, but a line had been crossed. Regina leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming lightly against the bass of her flute. She spoke again to her companion, this time more casually. "It's just that standards matter," she said. "If we let those go, well, everything else follows, doesn't it?" The man beside her murmured vaguely, still immersed in a market report on his tablet. Keanu returned his gaze to the book in his lap, but he wasn't reading. He wasn't even pretending anymore. His eyes stayed on the page, but his mind was elsewhere. He could feel it. The temperature in the room had dropped, not physically, but spiritually, and there was no doubt who had caused it. Regina turned slightly in her seat, shifting her shawl just enough to let one side fall behind her shoulder, revealing a diamond brooch that caught the light like a signal flare. She didn't speak for a moment. She didn't need to. Her performance now was in posture, in expression, in silence sharpened like a blade. But her words were never far behind. "Do you know?" she said to no one in particular, voice lifted just above the hum of conversation. "I once hosted an ambassador from Belgium on this very train, Saturday, right there in row 3. We discussed diplomacy, classical literature, the integrity of shared values. A man of such distinction." There was a pause. She let the implication hang in the air, then finished her sentence with a sip of wine. "Some seats carry memory," she added, "and expectation." Morgan remained still. He hadn't moved since returning his pass, but his stillness now carried more gravity than before. It wasn't passive, it was chosen, deliberate. The kind of silence that asks others to reveal themselves, and Regina had. She adjusted her shawl again, this time as if brushing off something invisible. Then she reached into her handbag and pulled out a slender pair of reading glasses, placing them on the tip of her nose like a judge about to read a verdict. To her left, a young publishing executive cleared his throat awkwardly and shifted in his seat. To her right, the older art broker she was seated with still hadn't looked up. It didn't matter. Her performance was for the room, not for her table. Keanu watched her without lifting his head. He recognized it. Not just the arrogance, but the discipline it took to disguise it as charm. The way some people layered their contempt beneath silk, handed it out like hors d'oeuvres, always wrapped in etiquette. And what struck him most wasn't her tone. It was Morgan's refusal to shrink. Because Keanu knew that silence. He'd lived it. On sets, in boardrooms, in late-night dinners, where assumptions replaced introductions. He had watched people ignore men like Morgan Freeman until someone whispered a name, and suddenly reverence bloomed where disregard had sat, moments before. But Morgan wasn't waiting for that whisper. He wasn't performing for anyone. He was just there, present, whole, unbothered by their need to measure his worth. And that, more than anything, seemed to threaten Regina. She shifted again in her seat. "Well," she said, voice lilting like a final brushstroke on a painting, "I suppose inclusion has its place." Keanu's eyes flicked toward her. Just once. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did and chose to pretend she didn't. The train pressed onward through the valley, the sun beginning to lower in the sky. Shadows stretched across the aisle like long fingers. The Alien car remained quiet, its passengers sipping, reading, nodding politely. But the air had changed, and every person in that car, whether they admitted it or not, could feel it. Regina's smile lingered just a second too long. The kind of smile that didn't mean welcome, didn't mean warmth, but something more precise, more calculated. It wasn't joy or kindness, it was punctuation. a closing mark on a judgment she had already written in her mind. "Oh," she had said earlier, tilting her head like she was admiring a quaint little shop she would never step inside. Honorary, then. How quaint. She knew exactly what that word implied. Not earned, not owned, just granted. Like a borrowed tuxedo or a ceremonial title. A temporary pass into a world someone hadn't been born into. Across the aisle, Morgan didn't react. He had returned to his journal, the pen moving slowly in steady curves. His fingers moved like they had learned how to resist the urge to stop writing every time someone threw shade disguised as silk. He didn't look at Regina. He didn't flinch. And somehow, that infuriated her more than if he had snapped back. Because she wasn't trying to embarrass him. She was trying to unsettle him. But the man wouldn't move. Toward the back, Keanu Reeves turned a page in his book, not because he was reading, but because it gave his hands something to do. His eyes lifted just slightly, glancing down the aisle toward Morgan. The carriage was too quiet for his liking. Not silent like peace, but the kind of quiet that follows cruelty. He saw it all. Morgan's posture hadn't changed. Regina's had. She leaned closer to her companions now, her voice dancing on the edge of volume. Not enough to be directly confrontational, just enough to be heard, without being accused. "We really must redefine elegance these days," she said, swirling the Bordeaux in her glass. "It seems everyone thinks decorum is optional now. Charm too." The man beside her, the one buried in his tablet, made a sound that might have been a chuckle or just indigestion. It didn't matter. Regina didn't need approval. She only needed a microphone, and this car, this space, had always given her one. "Of course," she went on, her voice lilting like a melody, just out of tune. "There's a kind of grace in knowing when one doesn't belong. It's an art, really. Some people used to recognize it naturally." Morgan's pen stopped for just a second, just one heartbeat, then continued. The page began to fill with ink again. A list, a sentence, a thought. Nothing dramatic, nothing angry, but measured. As if every word had to be tested for dignity before being allowed on the page. Regina lifted her glass and took a slow sip. Keanu exhaled quietly through his nose. He wasn't going to interrupt. Not yet. But his hand now rested flat against the cover of the book, the same book he had brought on dozens of trips. The one that reminded him who he was when the world tried to tell him otherwise. And this moment was starting to feel familiar. Regina set her glass down with a soft click, loud enough to punctuate her thought. Her shoulders straightened, her chin tilted at an angle of quiet superiority. She was no longer speaking to her table. She was speaking to the air, performing for the room as though it were her audience. "You know," she said lightly, "my late husband always reminded me that refinement is inherited, not improvised. It cannot be borrowed for the evening, like a shawl." Her words traveled down the aisle, slipping through conversations that had hushed just enough to catch them. The hedge fund partner across from her looked up briefly. The young publishing executive shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. But no one challenged her. No one ever did. Morgan's pen scratched steadily against the page. His face gave nothing away. The curve of his handwriting grew tighter, compressed, as though every letter had to push against the weight of the moment. His silence wasn't weakness, it was resistance. The kind of resistance that doesn't bend to another's expectation. Regina noticed. It gnawed at her. She tapped her manicured fingers against the stem of her glass, feigning absent-mindedness, though her eyes never left Morgan. "What's that he's writing, I wonder?" she murmured, though just loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear. A diary? A shopping list? Or perhaps a speech he wishes someone would listen to. The comment hung in the air like perfume, sweet but suffocating. Keanu looked up now, properly this time, his gaze steady, though his face remained unreadable. His eyes caught Regina's for a moment. She blinked once, then dismissed him with a flicker of her lashes, as though his glance were nothing more than dust brushed from silk. He lowered his eyes again, but the book remained unopened. The Hudson slipped by outside the windows, its waters glinting under the fading sun. Inside, the alien car had grown tense in its elegance. People still sipped their drinks, still shifted their silverware, still spoke about politics and art, but their ears tilted toward row 3. Regina leaned closer to the young executive on her left. "Exclusivity is not cruelty," she whispered, though her words carried. "It's preservation. When you allow too much drift, you lose the line. Elegance fades. Distinction disappears. And then what are we left with?" The young man nodded vaguely, unwilling to disagree, though his fingers drummed against his knee in discomfort. Morgan paused mid-sentence, glanced at the window, and then continued to write. He hadn't acknowledged her once, and that, more than anything, unsettled Regina Whitmore. For people like her, silence was supposed to be surrender, but Morgan's silence had teeth. It had history. It had weight. And every second he refused to give her what she wanted, her voice sharpened further, reaching for new ways to provoke him. Regina lifted her chin, her voice now rising above the low hum of dinner chatter. She spoke as though recalling a memory, but each word was aimed like an arrow. Across the aisle. "I recall traveling with my father when I was a girl," she began. "In those days, the Alean car was guarded by standards. Every passenger was known by name, background, and family. There were no surprises, no improvisations." She smiled thinly. "We never had to wonder who sat beside us." The comment was surgical. It was no longer disguised as casual. It was deliberate, meant to cut. Morgan's pen slowed. He finished the sentence, placed a period at the end of the line, and set the pen down. He did not look up. He folded his hands over the journal and rested them there, his shoulders steady, his breathing even. He did not give her what she wanted. Regina's lips tightened, the edges of her practiced smile faltering. For the first time, she looked unsettled. The young man to her left cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably. The hedge fund partner to her right finally looked up from his tablet, eyes narrowing slightly at the tension he could no longer ignore. Still, no one intervened. Regina reached for her glass, drained the last of her wine, and set it down with another sharp click. "Tradition," she said, her voice dripping with polished certainty, "is not a burden. It is a privilege, and privilege, once diluted, can never be restored." Morgan's eyes shifted, at last, not toward her, but toward the steward standing in the aisle with a tray. His expression remained calm, his silence remained intact. Keanu's gaze lifted again. This time, it lingered. He looked at Regina, not with anger, not with shock, but with the stillness of someone who had heard this tone 1,000 times before, in 100 different rooms. His hand remained on the closed book, his fingers curled lightly against the worn cover. Regina felt the weight of his stare. Her eyes flicked toward him, just briefly, and in that fleeting exchange, she realized something had shifted. She wasn't the only one commanding the air anymore. She looked away, unwilling to hold his gaze. The Alean car seemed smaller now. The elegant chatter of deals and politics had dulled. The room had narrowed into a triangle of tension. Regina, Morgan, Keanu, each playing a part, though only one was speaking. Morgan reached again for his pen. He opened the journal and wrote another line, slow, deliberate, unshaken. And in the soft curve of that handwriting, there was a declaration, not of anger, not of defense, but of refusal. He would not be moved. Regina straightened, her jaw tightening as her eyes glittered with the sting of being ignored. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried the sharp edge of desperation hidden beneath polish. "I suppose silence is an answer of its own," she said softly, though the whole car heard it. The rhythm of the train softened into a steady pulse, like a heartbeat carrying everyone westward. Glasses clinked, cutlery shifted, and beneath it all, Regina Whitmore's voice flowed, polished and poisonous. She leaned slightly forward, her fingers poised elegantly over the rim of her crystal flute, as if she were about to give a toast. "It is remarkable, isn't it?" she said lightly, "how the meaning of inclusion has changed. Once upon a time, it was the mark of a host, knowing precisely whom to welcome and whom to decline. These days they call it progress. I call it a cost." Her words floated effortlessly across the aisle. They were not sharp in tone, but in intent, each syllable dipped in honey to disguise the sting. Morgan's pen slowed across the page. It did not stop, but the letters grew tighter, his script pressing closer together, as though the ink itself felt the weight of her words. Regina tilted her glass, catching the reflection of the chandeliers. "When exclusivity dies," she murmured, "so does elegance." The table around her fell still for a beat. No one corrected her. No one dared to. The hedge fund partner busied himself with folding his napkin. The young executive lowered his gaze to the floor. They weren't her allies, but neither were they her challengers. Across the aisle, Morgan set his pen down briefly, allowing the journal to remain open on the table before him. His hand rested lightly atop the page, his thumb tapping once against the margin. His face gave nothing away, but Keanu noticed. From his seat at the back, his grip tightened around the book in his lap. His thumb pressed against the worn spine. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled just as slowly. He was not angry, not yet, but the quiet tension in his shoulders revealed that he was no longer reading. Regina did not look at either of them. She sipped her wine, then dabbed the corner of her mouth with a folded napkin. "I suppose this is the way of things now," she went on, her voice smooth. "Tradition diluted, standards relaxed, all in the name of progress. The question, of course, is whether progress is worth the price." Her words landed softly, but in the silence that followed, they echoed louder than any shout. Morgan's eyes lowered to the journal again. He lifted the pen, placed it against the paper, and resumed writing, his hand steady but his strokes deliberate, as if each word was measured against the weight of what had just been said. Keanu leaned back in his chair, the book still closed in his hands. His jaw flexed once, but he remained silent. The Alean car, wrapped in velvet and cedar, had grown colder, not in temperature, but in spirit, and everyone inside knew it. The train cut through rolling countryside, its windows framing the fading light of day. Inside, the atmosphere of the Alean car carried the same surface elegance, but beneath it ran a current of unease. Regina sat with her back straight, her shawl draped carefully over one shoulder, her lips curved in that practiced smile she used when she wanted to draw blood without raising her voice. "You see," she said to the young executive beside her, "elegance is not only about appearance, it is about curation, about ensuring that the right people, the suitable people, are in the right rooms. Anything else is simply theater." The executive shifted uncomfortably. He gave a faint nod, but his eyes betrayed him, darting briefly toward Morgan as though unsure of what he was complicit in by saying nothing. Morgan's journal lay open before him, the pen moving again with measured rhythm. He didn't pause this time. He wrote with a calm persistence, each stroke of ink steady, unhurried. His silence had its own strength, and though it did not interrupt Regina, it resisted her. Regina's eyes flicked to him again, narrowing. His refusal to answer her, to even look up, was beginning to wear against her patience. She thrived on reactions. She fed on acknowledgement. And yet here was a man who gave her nothing, who absorbed her words without bending under their weight. It made her voice sharpen. "It is rather extraordinary, isn't it?" she said, her tone pitched higher so that the entire row could hear, "how some can walk into a place built on heritage and believe that presence alone is enough to earn them a place here, as if heritage were negotiable, as if history could be written over with a single name." The words struck harder this time. Subtlety abandoned. Her intent was laid bare. Keanu closed his book at last. The sound was soft, almost indistinct, but in the quiet of the car, it landed like a declaration. He rested the book flat in his lap, one hand over the cover. His gaze remained lowered, but his stillness deepened. Morgan didn't move. His pen traced another line across the page. His breathing was calm, his face composed, his silence intact. The steward Jameson passed by with a tray of crystal glasses, his expression carefully neutral. He glanced at Morgan's journal, then quickly looked away, as though afraid to betray recognition. He knew what was happening, but he had neither the power nor the courage to intervene. Regina leaned back, satisfied that her words had landed. She reached for her glass once more, swirling the wine before taking a slow sip. She had delivered her judgment to the room, but though she believed herself victorious, she hadn't noticed the change. The air in the alien car was shifting. It wasn't silence anymore. It was expectation. And Keanu Reeves was no longer reading. Regina leaned forward, elbows on the table, as if settling into a lecture she'd been waiting her whole life to deliver. Her voice was gentler now, even wistful. "There was a time," she said, "when people knew the difference between access and belonging. When one had to earn the right to sit at the table, not simply be invited for show." She paused, letting the sentence stretch. Then, she smiled faintly, as if reflecting on some private victory. "To me," she added, "what's tragic is not that standards have changed, but that people pretend they haven't." No one replied. Her companions gave the kind of polite gestures that passed for agreement when disagreement might be too costly. Morgan's pen stopped. He folded the journal closed and placed the pen carefully beside it. Then he looked out the window, resting his temple against two fingers, the gesture quiet, thoughtful. Keanu shifted in his seat. His elbow rested on the armrest now, and one leg crossed over the other. He was angled slightly toward the aisle, toward Morgan, and though his expression was still calm, something in his posture had changed. There was no more passive listening. There was presence. Regina wasn't finished. She reached for her wine again, lifting the glass with grace and watching the liquid swirl. "Of course, everyone's so sensitive these days," she mused. "Say anything honest, and they call it cruel. Say anything traditional, and they call it exclusion." She turned slightly, her eyes sweeping the room, as though daring someone to challenge her. "It's exhausting," she said with a faint laugh, "pretending we don't see what we clearly see." Keanu's eyes flicked to her again, but still he said nothing. It was Morgan who moved first, only slightly. He straightened in his seat and lifted his journal once more, not to write, but to slide it back into the leather bag at his feet. The gesture was small, deliberate, but it held weight. It was a closing, a boundary. Regina watched, her smile fading just a shade. "Are we done writing then?" she asked lightly. Morgan didn't answer. He folded his hands in his lap and turned once more toward the window. Outside, the light had begun to soften into gold, casting long streaks across the hills and fields. The train moved onward, its motion smooth, silent, but inside the car something had stopped moving. The false ease, the forced charm, the illusion of shared space. It had cracked. Regina noticed it, and in the quiet that followed, she reached again not for connection, but for control. "I do hope I haven't made anyone uncomfortable," she said with mock concern. "That's never my intent. But sometimes truth does that. Rattles the air a little." Keanu uncrossed his legs. The book remained closed in his lap. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, gaze pointed straight down the aisle, still silent, but ready. The clinking of silverware began to fill the alien car as dinner service commenced. Waitstaff moved in synchronized patterns, dressed in black vests and white gloves, unfolding linen napkins with swift, silent efficiency. Candlelight shimmered on every polished surface, glancing off crystal and silver. Dishes of rosemary lamb, charred asparagus, and whipped potatoes arrived at each table with the kind of elegance that demanded silence. Morgan Freeman remained still. His plate arrived, untouched. The wine he had declined was replaced with sparkling water. The journal was no longer open. It had been returned to his bag, and his hands now rested loosely on the table's edge. He looked out the window, but the reflection in the glass was clearer than the darkening hills beyond. Across the aisle, Regina Whitmore watched him without blinking. She had not spoken in several minutes, but her silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. She had offered her statements, layered in condescension, disguised as culture. They hadn't worked. He had not played along. He had not flinched. And now she was losing the room. Not openly. Not yet. But she could feel the shift. Whispers had begun. 2 rows behind her, a couple exchanged glances. The hedge fund partner beside her had grown stiff. The young executive beside him was chewing slower, looking down more often. There was a tremor in the stillness now, a warning in the walls of the car. And she hated it. She would reclaim the space. She had to. Regina rose slowly from her seat, her napkin gliding off her lap as though caught in a rehearsed motion. She lifted her glass of Bordeaux, let it catch the candlelight, and turned with a smile that had been practiced in mirrors for decades. "I do so love trains," she said aloud, letting her voice travel effortlessly down the aisle. "They remind us of the days when travel meant character, not chaos." Her words were poised as though delivered to no one in particular, but everyone knew where they were meant to land. She took a single step into the aisle, then another. And then, as she neared Morgan's table, it happened. Her elbow shifted outward, subtle but intentional. The base of the wine glass slipped from her hand, and the rich red liquid arched through the air like a drawn curtain. It struck Morgan's right sleeve. The wine splashed across the fabric, streaking the dark wool with deep burgundy lines that soaked in instantly. Gasps erupted. 3 passengers froze mid-bite. Another woman, halfway through a sip of tea, paused with the cup just below her chin. Regina turned, a hand to her chest. "Oh goodness," she said, eyes wide with theatrical horror. "I'm so terribly clumsy these days. I do hope that isn't real cashmere." Morgan looked down at his sleeve, then up at her. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy. And from the back of the car, Keanu Reeves stood. He didn't speak, he didn't rush, he didn't slam a hand on the table or raise a voice to shatter the illusion of civility. Keanu simply rose from his seat, like a shadow peeling itself away from the floor. His movements were quiet, but not passive. There was purpose in the way his boots touched the cedar floor. Each step was weightless but final, like a question that already knew the answer. The alien car seemed to contract around him. Forks paused in midair. Conversations stuttered into silence. Even the waitstaff slowed, their choreographed patterns interrupted by the invisible force of something unspoken. Keanu crossed the aisle and walked toward Morgan's table. Regina had turned back toward her seat. Already in the middle of an exaggerated apology, her voice coated in faux concern. "Oh, truly, I must be losing my balance. So embarrassing. And that wine well, it's practically ink, isn't it? I do hope your jacket isn't ruined." She turned back, her hand still at her chest. But Keanu had already arrived. He bent slightly and picked up the cloth napkin that had fallen just beside Morgan's chair. He handed it back to him respectfully, quietly. The gesture wasn't grand, but it felt like a curtain lifting. Then he straightened and turned to Regina. The train was still moving, but it felt like everything else had stopped. "You didn't spill wine," Keanu said, his voice calm, steady. "You spilled the last ounce of grace you had." Regina's smile froze. "I beg your pardon?" she asked, even though she had heard him perfectly. Keanu tilted his head just slightly, not in defiance, in clarity. "No," he said. "You don't. That's the point." The words didn't come like accusations. They came like a verdict. Unshakable. Clear. Undeniable. Regina's face tightened. The room wasn't with her anymore. She could feel it. Behind her, a woman at the next table sat rigid, her eyes darting between Keanu and Morgan. The older gentleman across the aisle lowered his newspaper just slightly. The young man at the back, who had been quietly filming earlier, now held his phone still, his mouth parted in disbelief. Morgan had not moved. He remained seated, gently dabbing at the stain on his sleeve with the napkin Keanu had handed him. The wine soaked deeper into the fabric, crimson against charcoal. But his expression remained serene, untouched by the mess, untouched by the moment. Keanu didn't look around the room. His eyes were fixed only on Regina. Not hostile, not angry, just present. "You're used to people stepping aside," he said. "Used to the room adjusting to your discomfort. Used to never being questioned." Regina's breath caught. She tried to smile again, but it landed flat. Keanu's voice dropped just slightly, but somehow it carried even more weight. "Not today." The train hummed beneath them, steady as a heartbeat. But inside the car, the silence roared. Regina opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She blinked once, as though searching for the version of this scene where she still had control. But that version had slipped away the moment Keanu stood. A voice from 2 tables away whispered, "Wait, is that really Keanu Reeves?" Someone else murmured. He stood up for him. And just like that, the air shifted again, not toward drama, but toward something deeper recognition. The man in row 3, the one who had said nothing all this time, who had written in a journal and sipped his water and declined every insult with silence, was no longer invisible. Morgan lifted his head now. He looked directly at Keanu. Their eyes met not as actor and icon, not as legend and defender, but as men. Keanu gave a small nod, nothing exaggerated. Morgan held his gaze for a moment longer, then returned it with a quiet, "Thank you." Just 2 words, but they landed with more weight than anything Regina had spoken in the past hour. The car was utterly still. Regina finally found her voice. It came out thin, brittle. "Mr. Reeves, is it?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked at her the way someone looks at a collapsing building, not with anger, but inevitability. "Yes," he said simply. Around the room, shoulders turned, heads tilted, whispers buzzed beneath breath. Regina's composure was unraveling now, thread by thread. She smoothed her shawl again, as if adjusting it might restore what she had lost. "I'm used to standards, Mr. Reeves," she said, with a controlled breath. Keanu's response was low, firm, and without hesitation. "There's a difference between standards and walls, and you've been building walls your whole life." No one moved, no one spoke. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words filled the space the way light fills a room once the curtain is pulled. "You think dignity can be inherited. That legacy means license. That power means worth. But it doesn't. Not here. Not today." Regina looked around the car, searching for a face to support her. She found none. Keanu turned back to Morgan. The sleeve of Morgan's jacket was stained, but he wore it with the same grace he had worn every silent moment. He looked calm, composed, as if the storm had always been inevitable. Keanu took one final look at Regina. Then he stepped back without another word and returned to his seat, not with drama, but with decision. He sat down, opened the book again, and turned the page not just in the story, but in the room. The Alien car remained silent, not the silence of ignorance, but the silence that follows truth. Keanu stood in stillness, not because he wanted to be seen, but because something inside him would no longer allow him to sit. The moment had crossed a line, not in volume, but in weight. And once that line was crossed, silence no longer meant strength, it meant surrender, and he was done surrendering. He stepped forward slowly, no theatrics, no noise, just the soft rhythm of boots on cedar flooring. Eyes followed him, not all at once. Some pretended to remain in their menus or in their wine glasses, but one by one, heads lifted. Conversations stopped, not from instruction, but from instinct. Even the servers paused, trays balanced mid-air, unsure whether to keep moving. Keanu reached the center aisle and bent at the waist. He picked up the cloth napkin that had fallen during Regina's accident. It had landed just behind Morgan's chair, folded over on itself like a forgotten gesture of civility. He picked it up gently and offered it back to Morgan with a nod. The older man accepted it without a word, only the smallest lift of his brow in acknowledgement. Then Keanu turned. He faced Regina. Her expression, composed only moments ago, had shifted. There was confusion now, a faint flicker of disbelief, and then he spoke. "You didn't spill wine," he said, his voice quiet, steady, and sharp. "You spilled the last ounce of grace you had." The room froze. Someone dropped a fork 2 tables away, and the sound echoed louder than it should have. Regina blinked. "I'm sorry?" she asked, her tone tight, unsure whether to treat his comment as insult or misunderstanding. Keanu took a small step forward. Not aggressive, but undeniable. "No, you're not," he said. "That's the point." Regina's mouth opened just slightly, but nothing came out. She glanced sideways at her table companions, looking for someone to speak. No one did. "You're used to the room adjusting to you," Keanu continued, "to your discomfort, your commentary, your theater. You think civility means control. That legacy means you always get the last word. His words didn't rise in volume, but they filled the space like thunder rolling in the distance. You've dressed cruelty and etiquette so many times, you think they're the same thing. Regina straightened in her seat, her fingers tightening on the stem of her wine glass. She tried to interrupt. I think you're overreacting, Mr. Reeves. But Keanu cut in, his voice unwavering. Number, you didn't merely spill wine. You didn't merely make a comment. You've spent the last hour drawing a line you expected everyone to accept. And when he wouldn't cross it, you tried to stain him for it. The words landed with a force that words rarely carry. Not because they were loud, but because they were true. Regina looked as though she wanted to protest, but nothing came quickly enough to her lips. The practiced charm had cracked. The arsenal of rehearsed smiles and clever phrases no longer held power. For once, she was in a room that didn't turn when she did. And that realization hit harder than anything Keanu had said. Keanu didn't move closer. He didn't raise his voice, but his presence pressed in like gravity. You talk about standards, he said, but what you mean is comfort. You mean control. You mean that the world should keep shaping itself around your version of acceptable. The air inside the alien car was tighter now, more focused. It was as if the entire train was listening. And when it doesn't, he continued, you call it loss. You call it decline. You call it the end of elegance. He let the word sit there, elegance. Then he looked at Morgan, still seated, still calm, his sleeve still stained with Bordeaux, but his face was lit with a quiet, knowing calm. A strength that didn't need to interrupt because dignity never needed volume. Keanu turned back to Regina. Elegance isn't exclusion, he said. It's grace, under pressure. It's presence without performance. And if anyone here has shown that tonight, it's him. Regina inhaled sharply, a reaction that was more reflex than response. And you, Keanu said, softer now, you've turned grace into a weapon. A long silence followed. The alien car no longer whispered. It simply watched. The conductor had appeared at the far end of the car, standing still, not stepping forward just yet. The waitstaff held their trays like statues. Even the chandelier lighting above seemed dimmer, as though unwilling to interfere. Regina tried again. I think you're misinterpreting a simple no, Keanu replied, still not angry. You're hoping everyone forgets what you meant because you wrapped it in a smile. She looked away, just briefly, toward the window, but there was nowhere to look that could undo what had already been said. Keanu let the silence return. Then, at last, he stepped back, not in retreat, but in return. He looked at Morgan once more. Their eyes met again. Something unspoken passed between them. Not just thanks, not just solidarity, recognition. Morgan gave the smallest nod. Then Keanu turned and walked slowly back to his seat. He didn't look at anyone else. He didn't acknowledge the murmurs that were starting to rise. He simply sat down the same way he had stood, calm, certain. He placed the book on the table beside him. He didn't open it this time. He didn't need to. The story had already begun to change, and everyone in that car, especially Regina Whitmore, knew it. Regina sat frozen. Her fingers hovered above her plate, unsure whether to reach for her fork or her glass, or simply fold into themselves. Her world, so carefully constructed with rituals, expectations, and inherited dominance, had not just been questioned, it had been seen through. And the worst part was that no one came to her defense. No one deflected, no one changed the subject. Across the aisle, Morgan adjusted the cuff of his jacket. A small motion, nothing grand. He dabbed once more at the stained sleeve, then folded the napkin neatly on his lap. The gesture was simple, but its meaning rang clear. He would not carry the mess she had tried to leave on him. Not in cloth, not in spirit. A soft clink echoed as the young executive to Regina's left set down his water glass. His expression had changed. His eyes now followed Morgan with something like reverence, or maybe regret. The kind of awareness that arrives too late. From the far end of the alien car, Someone clapped once. Not loud, not eager, just a single quiet beat of recognition. Then silence again. Keanu remained seated, eyes forward, no longer needing to hold the tension in the room. It was doing that on its own now. The man 2 rows up leaned to his wife and whispered, "That's Morgan Freeman, isn't it?" She nodded slowly, her eyes wide. That was Keanu Reeves. And just like that, the curtain lifted. Names took shape where assumptions had once lived. A collective hush settled not out of fear but realization, not just of who they were, but of what they had failed to see. Regina pressed her lips together. For a woman like her, silence had always been a tool, a threat, a dismissal. But now, for the first time, it was being used against her, and it cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. She glanced again at Morgan, perhaps hoping for a chance to repair what had been shattered. But Morgan wasn't watching her. He was looking out the window, where dusk had settled over the hills like a soft blanket. His reflection looked back at him in the glass, unbothered, untouched. In the quiet, a voice finally broke the stillness. It was Morgan's, low, warm, unshaken. "You don't have to raise your voice," he said. "Not to Keanu, not to anyone in particular, when the truth already echoes louder than the lie." That was all. No performance, no applause. Just a sentence dropped, like a stone into water. And the ripple moved through every person in the room. Keanu closed his eyes briefly, not in fatigue, but in quiet affirmation. Morgan leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and let the rhythm of the train take over once more. The alien car moved on, but it would not forget. The hum of the train was the only thing moving. Inside the alien car, even the air had gone still. No one touched their wine. No one shifted in their seats. It was as if the moment had frozen the space in place, holding every gaze, every breath in a collective pause. Keanu hadn't moved again. He sat where he was, steady, composed. But when he spoke, his voice reached every corner of the car without needing to rise. "That wasn't wine," he said, eyes fixed down the aisle. That was a warning dressed as etiquette. Regina's head turned, slowly, as though each degree of movement required effort. Her lips parted. She looked at Keanu, stunned, not because she didn't understand what he meant, but because she did. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. No protest, no defense, just silence. Keanu looked forward, not just at her, but past her, beyond her. His words were no longer for one person. "I've seen that kind of thing before," he said. "In boardrooms, at premieres, in dressing rooms backstage, the same tone, the same gestures, small enough to deny, loud enough to be felt." His eyes swept slowly over the cabin, over the polished brass sconces and velvet seats, over the guests who suddenly found it difficult to meet his gaze. "I've watched people smile while pulling the rug out from under someone who never saw it coming, and then act surprised when they hit the floor." The passengers said nothing. Some looked away, some sat straighter, some simply stared, suspended in the weight of what was unfolding. Keanu didn't flinch. "I've seen janitors talked down to by executives who couldn't change a light bulb if their life depended on it. I've seen assistants made invisible in rooms they built with their own sweat. I've seen actors dismissed until someone whispered a name, and then everyone turned. His voice didn't shake. It flowed calm, unwavering. And I've seen men like him," he said, gesturing gently toward Morgan, "sit in rooms like this, carrying more grace and silence than most people can manage in their loudest hour, and still be treated like they're lucky to be here." Morgan lifted his head now. He met Keanu's gaze, steady and strong, and nodded once. The gesture was small, but in the silence that followed, it rang like a bell. Keanu turned back toward the others. "This isn't about spilled wine. It never was. It's about what we think people owe us when we're used to being the loudest voice in the room." Regina sat motionless. Her hands rested in her lap, knuckles pale, her expression unreadable. But her silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of power. It was the silence of someone being seen for what they were clearly for the first time in a long time. Keanu remained seated, his words still lingering in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. He looked down the aisle, not at any one person, but as if speaking to ghosts only he could see. "You know what I've learned?" he said. "Softer now, yet still unmissable. The most dangerous kind of disrespect doesn't come from shouting. It comes from expectation, from entitlement dressed as tradition." No one moved. I've seen it in the way someone walks past a cleaning lady like she doesn't exist, in how the waiter who forgets a drink is treated like a failure, not a person, in the pause, just long enough, before shaking a hand that looks different. His eyes found Regina again, and in how someone accidentally spills a glass of red wine on the quietest person in the room, then smiles like it was clumsiness, not choreography. Regina swallowed. Once. Slowly. He didn't wait for her to respond. There was nothing she could say that would change what had already been seen, what had already been heard. Keanu shifted his gaze now across the room, allowing it to land on the older businessman who had been pretending to read the paper, on the woman in burgundy who had raised her eyebrow earlier but said nothing, on the hedge fund partner who still held his fork midair. This car, this beautiful, polished, exclusive car, wasn't built just to move people. It was built to remind people of a time, a feeling. But the thing about nostalgia is it can lie. It can make us long for a version of the past that never existed, or one that only worked for a few. He leaned back, his voice steady. What's timeless isn't silver rails and Bordeaux. What's timeless is how we treat the people we think we can ignore. The weight of the words sank in. Several passengers shifted in their seats. A napkin was folded with trembling fingers. A water glass was refilled by a steward who, just moments before, had been hesitant to move at all. Regina's voice finally returned, but it came out weaker than intended. "This is becoming rather theatrical," she said, attempting a smirk. "Are we really having a social awakening on a dinner train?" Keanu turned toward her, slow, composed. "No," he said gently. "We're having a reckoning." Her lips parted to fire back, but she found herself exhaling instead. Her eyes dropped for a moment, just a flicker, but it was enough. Morgan reached for his napkin again, gently folding it over his sleeve. Then he looked up at her, and for the first time that evening, addressed her directly. "I've had people spill worse than wine on me and call it kindness," he said. "But that doesn't mean I have to carry the stain for them." The words weren't sharp, they were clean, precise, and when he finished speaking, the room exhaled, not in relief, in recognition, because everyone knew it wasn't just Regina who'd been seen. Morgan gave a small nod, not of thanks, but of understanding. Keanu didn't smile. He didn't need to. Regina remained silent, her reflection now clearer than the wineglass before her, and as the train continued forward, so did something else, dignity, perhaps for the first time in that room. A subtle chime sounded overhead, one not heard often in the legacy car. Conversations faltered. The dining room's hum grew still. From the end of the car, the door hissed open. Stepping through in crisp navy uniform and white gloves, the conductor entered. He moved with quiet purpose, holding a sealed envelope in one hand and a thin electronic tablet in the other. His nameplate read, A. Beltran, but it was the air around him measured, respectful, that quieted the passengers more than his presence alone. His eyes scanned the room. Not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with precision. The kind of awareness that came from decades riding rails with people who wore titles louder than manners. He had seen enough to know who demanded attention and who deserved it. Stopping just short of the table where Regina still sat stiff and cold, he turned toward the far window seat. "Mr. Freeman," the conductor said clearly, but with a warm undertone, "on behalf of the Alien Rail Historical Society, the crew would like to extend its highest recognition." The words didn't just echo. They reverberated. Regina's teacup clinked slightly against the saucer she now gripped too tightly. The conductor bowed slightly, his gesture deep and deliberate. Then he handed the envelope to Morgan Freeman with both hands, as if passing on something sacred. Morgan accepted it with his usual quiet grace, lifting his eyes to the conductor. He didn't open the envelope immediately. Instead, he set his pen down and looked around the room. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was reverent. Keanu remained at his table, his gaze resting gently on Morgan. There was no smile, no nod, just presence. Enough to say he already knew. The conductor continued. Mr. Freeman is not only a distinguished guest today, he is also one of the original founding patrons of the Alien car itself. His donation 25 years ago preserved this historic coach during a time when it was nearly decommissioned. Without his contribution, none of us would be dining here tonight. That line landed harder than any insult Regina had launched all evening. Eyes turned not toward her, but toward Morgan. Not only did he belong here, he had built the very space she had tried to cast him out of. Regina's jaw tightened, her fingers twitched, and her usual vocabulary of deflection and charm offered nothing now. Not even a whisper. The conductor stepped back. "It is our privilege to serve you again, sir," he added. Then something rare happened. Applause. Not just the soft, obligatory kind. It began with a firm clap from the rear of the car, likely one of the younger passengers who had been watching everything unfold. Then another followed, and another, until the car, built for quiet class and exclusivity, began to fill with something far more meaningful. Recognition. Some applauded politely, others with hands warmed by guilt. But all of them clapped for Morgan Freeman, and as the conductor stepped aside, Morgan slowly stood, not grandly, not with any need to prove a point, just enough to acknowledge the moment. He gave a slight nod toward Keanu, then one to Jameson, the steward. Then, finally, to the conductor. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Regina finally looked up, not to speak, not to argue, but because she had to, because even she couldn't pretend the train hadn't changed direction. Regina's fingers, once poised in control, now trembled just enough to be noticed by those closest. The pristine illusion she'd wrapped herself in had begun to unravel, thread by quiet thread. Her pearls no longer shimmered with command. Her posture, though still upright, carried the stiffness of someone trying to sit inside a shrinking world. Across the aisle, Keanu remained still. He hadn't applauded, not out of indifference, but reverence. His silence was a deeper kind of applause, one that didn't require noise to be felt. When Morgan sat back, down, their eyes met again. No need for words. Their understanding had already passed through a shared current of dignity. Jameson, the steward who'd endured Regina's scorn since boarding, stepped forward from the side corridor. He carried a polished silver tray, nothing out of the ordinary, except the single glass of vintage sherry resting on it. He walked past Regina and set the glass gently in front of Morgan. "With the compliments of the dining staff, Mr. Freeman," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Morgan gave a warm nod. "Thank you, Jameson. It's been a long time since I tasted that particular kindness." Jameson smiled, his posture rising just slightly taller than before. Another ripple moved through the room, smaller than the applause, but somehow more enduring. The kind of shift that settles into the floorboards of a place. A new kind of memory, laid over the old. Regina, sensing the narrowing options before her, lifted her own wine glass with a porcelain smile. "Well," she said, trying to summon the room's attention back, "what a charming surprise. I suppose some things really do improve with age." But it was too late for charm, too late for the weaponized elegance she had relied on for years. Even the newer passengers, the ones who had initially admired her, now watched her with a kind of careful detachment, as if they were trying to remember why they ever found her impressive in the first place. Regina turned toward Keanu. "I imagine this is amusing to you." Keanu didn't look amused. He didn't even look at her. He simply reached for his water glass and took a slow sip, then returned it to the linen coaster. It was a gesture of refusal, an elegant one. Regina blinked. It hit her then. The conductor's recognition, the steward's gesture, the passenger's applause. None of it had been orchestrated to shame her. That would have been a relief. A targeted slight would at least validate her sense of importance. But this was worse. This was the natural course of a world evolving without her. No memo, no announcement, just people shifting toward dignity, like sunlight reaching a place long in shadow. And she was no longer standing in the light. The applause didn't stop for Regina. It rose for truth, for grace, and for the ones who never demanded it. It began as a murmur, barely louder than the clinking of silverware and the hum of the train beneath their feet. "That's Morgan Freeman," a young woman whispered, her voice uncertain yet reverent, like someone realizing they had just walked past a legend without noticing. Others turned. Slowly, one by one, the people in the alley and car began to really look. Not glance, not scan, but look. Eyeglasses lowered. Phones paused mid-scroll. Forks halted in mid-air. Conversations faltered, and in that stillness, the ripple became a wave. A man near the window set his napkin down. A couple behind Regina leaned forward. Someone softly said, "He's been here the whole time?" The room began to shift, not physically, but in tone. The energy changed. The air, once heavy with unspoken assumptions and layers of curated etiquette, now carried something raw. Humility. Jameson, the steward, stood frozen. Then, moving as if jolted by something more than surprise, he approached Morgan slowly, the color draining from his face. "Sir, I didn't realize," Jameson stammered. "Please forgive me." Morgan didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, as it had been through every cutting word, every sideways glance, every whispered slight. "You didn't fail because you didn't know who I was," Morgan said softly. "You failed because you didn't look." The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They landed like stones in a still pond, each one sending waves outward that crashed against fragile facades. Regina's smile vanished. Her posture stiffened, then curled inward. Her shoulders no longer sat proud. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass, as if it were an anchor. Keanu didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence had always been the louder voice in the room. He simply shifted in his seat, just slightly, eyes still on Morgan with the quiet solidarity of someone who had seen all this unfold long before it became clear to others. The guests began to murmur again, this time not in ridicule, but in remorse. Snippets of guilt hung in the air. "I thought he was just... I didn't even... He was writing the whole time, how did I miss it?" Regina remained silent. She blinked twice, her face pale. She looked to the conductor, as if hoping for a distraction, a break, anything. But the conductor merely stepped aside, giving the moment space. Someone in the back clapped, one slow, deliberate clap, then another, and another, until the room filled with the sound of delayed recognition. It wasn't applause for fame. It was for endurance, for patience, for dignity, held in silence while arrogance dressed itself in performance. Morgan remained seated, pen still in hand, notebook still open. His thumb traced the edge of the paper. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't basking. He simply was. The same man he had been since stepping onto the train, only now the room was catching up. Regina finally spoke, but only to herself. "How?" Her voice cracked like old porcelain. It was a single syllable wrapped in disbelief and shrinking pride. She looked around the car for support, for anyone who might still mirror her sense of superiority. But the reflections had shattered. The mask had slipped, and no one was reaching to help her put it back on. Jameson remained at Morgan's side, still struggling to compose himself. "I'm so sorry," he repeated, his voice hushed now. "We thought you were just..." He trailed off, ashamed to finish the sentence. "A man beneath attention?" Morgan offered gently. Jameson's eyes welled. "Yes." Morgan placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, not out of dominance, but as a quiet gesture of understanding. "Then let this be your moment to start seeing again." The guests shifted in their seats, some nodding, others looking down at their hands, as if the shine of their watches and rings no longer comforted them. The Alayan car, once a chamber of invisible hierarchy, had become a mirror. Keanu stood, the gesture quiet but firm. "There's a cost to seeing people only for their roles," he said, "not to shame, but to teach." you stop noticing who they are. He turned his gaze slowly across the car from the guests in formal wear to the servers, to Regina, and finally to Morgan. But when you finally do see, you can't unsee it. Morgan smiled faintly. The guests listened, not out of politeness, out of necessity. Regina fumbled for her voice. I didn't mean, but Keanu held up a hand, not to silence, but to stop the excuse before it could hide behind words. You don't need to explain, he said. You just need to reflect. Her jaw tightened. The mask of charm and power began to erode under the quiet storm of dignity surrounding her. She reached for her glass again, but didn't sip. Her hand trembled too much. A woman across the aisle cleared her throat. I owe you an apology, Mr. Freeman, she said, rising. I looked past you, I assumed, and I regret it. Morgan gave a small nod. It's not the first time, he replied, his voice calm, but it matters every time someone chooses to do better. Then a man in a tailored suit stood. I'd like to say the same. Another followed, and another, until it became a wave of acknowledgement. Not performative, not loud, but real. Regina remained seated, alone in her silence. She wasn't shunned. She was simply no longer centered. That, for her, was the true loss, and she felt it, deeply. As the conversation resumed, softer this time, it flowed around her, instead of through her. The circle had opened, but not for her applause. It had opened for Morgan, for Keanu, for the quiet truths that had waited long enough. Regina sat still, her smile gone, her authority muted not by force, but by awakening. Around her, people leaned forward not toward her, but toward meaning. Morgan's presence, once dismissed, now anchored the room. Keanu said nothing more. He didn't need to. The room had shifted. The illusion had broken. And Regina, for once, couldn't command it back. The dam had broken, not in chaos, but in clarity, in grace. What had once been her stage was now Morgan's sanctuary. She lowered her eyes, no longer to look away, but because she finally saw. And for the first time, it stung. Keanu remained still for a moment, then stepped slightly forward, his voice steady and low, yet somehow louder than the noise of the train itself. You thought he stumbled into your world, Keanu said, his gaze fixed not only on Regina, but on the entire car. But we're all riding through his. The words lingered like smoke in the air, curling around every passenger's neck, tightening gently, not choking, but waking. Some shifted in their seats. Others stared straight ahead, as if looking into a mirror they weren't ready for. Regina, frozen in posture, gave no reply. Morgan didn't lift his head immediately. He stared at the table in front of him, hand resting beside the sealed envelope the conductor had given him. The applause had faded, but not the weight of what had happened. And still, there was a strange, quiet dignity to everything now, a clarity that no fine wine or silk gown could distort. The conductor, still standing at attention near the velvet partition, cleared his throat. There has been a seating reassignment, he said gently. Miss Crown, due to the disruption and in accordance with our code of conduct, we must relocate you to standard class. Your belongings will be transferred ahead of you. The language was polite, but the meaning was sharp. A verdict wrapped in formality. Regina blinked, once. Her breath caught at her throat. For a moment, it seemed like she would contest it. Raise her voice, invoke her name. Call for someone she believed mattered more. But she didn't. Her pride had absorbed too many bruises already. Her confidence had cracked under the scrutiny of silence. Now there was just disbelief. Cold, humiliating disbelief. She pushed back her chair, its scrape across the wood louder than the announcement itself. Her napkin fell from her lap to the floor. She didn't retrieve it. Regina stood with precision, not grace. Her shoulders were square, but her expression faltered. She turned to face the aisle, eyes darting over familiar faces, now unwilling to meet her gaze. No one smiled, no one nodded, no one offered even the shallow support of silence. The curtain of influence she had worn for years had dropped, leaving her in the vulnerable light of consequence. Morgan looked up then, not smug, not angry, just tired. worn, as if he had watched this moment 100 times, in different forms, different people, different masks falling away, in different rooms. He didn't gloat in her fall. He only bore witness. Keanu stepped aside, allowing Regina room to pass. He didn't look at her again. She walked past Morgan, slowly. Her heels echoed against the floorboards, tapping out a rhythm of downfall. As she reached the door at the far end of the alien car, she stopped and turned slightly. For a second, just a second, her mouth parted like she wanted to say something. An apology, a curse, a protest, but nothing came. The train hummed on. She stepped through the door. The door closed behind Regina with a muted hiss, the kind that usually went unnoticed on luxury trains. But now, it sounded final, like the last page of a chapter being pressed shut. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the conductor stepped forward once more and turned toward Morgan. "Sir," he said respectfully, "we'd be honored to reseat you more comfortably if you wish. A private section is available in the founder's cabin." Morgan's head tilted slightly, but he offered a soft smile and a slow shake of the head. "Thank you," he replied. "But I'll stay here. Feels right." The conductor nodded and backed away, letting the stillness fill in again. Keanu glanced around the alien car. The gold-rimmed glasses, the untouched entrees, the books opened and forgotten. The sharp edges of power had dulled in this space. The air had shifted from exclusive to exposed. He looked to Morgan. "Do you want to open it?" he asked, motioning to the sealed envelope that still sat untouched between them. Morgan tapped his fingers once against it, like feeling its weight, then slid his thumb beneath the flap. The seal broke with a soft crack. Inside was a single card, heavy paper, embossed lettering. He read it, nodded, and then held it out to Keanu. Keanu took it and read aloud. "Morgan Freeman is hereby recognized as a founding patron of the Alien Initiative, a network dedicated to preserving storytelling, justice, and human dignity aboard every journey." He looked up. "It's signed by the board of directors." There was silence again, but this time it was reverent, not awkward. A silence that knew it was standing in the presence of something weightier than status. A younger man at the far end of the car, Jameson raised his voice slightly, though it shook. "Sir, I had no idea," he said, his words directed toward Morgan. I assumed you were just..." He stopped. "Ashamed." Morgan smiled gently. "Just what, son?" Jameson swallowed. "Just an old man on a train." Some people turned to look at him, but not with scorn, with quiet recognition. Many of them had thought the same thing, said the same thing in whispers or looks or passive glances. But only Jameson had the courage to name it aloud now. Morgan nodded once. "And that's all right. We all assume things," he said softly. "The trouble isn't in what we don't know. It's in when we stop looking." His eyes swept the room, not accusing, inviting. "I didn't need a plaque to matter. I didn't need your recognition to remember who I am. But now that you know, maybe ask yourself why it took a title for your eyes to open." That landed hard. You could feel it. Not as shame, but as revelation. Several people lowered their eyes. A woman dabbed her cheek with a linen napkin. Someone else shifted, as if seeing their own father or grandfather or teacher in a new light. The illusion of class, of assumption, had cracked, but something real was breaking through. Keanu leaned closer and whispered, "Now, the journey truly begins." The dining car had changed. Not physically, no new decor, no swapped silverware, but something deeper had settled into the space. Gone was the brittle air of performance, the stifling superiority that had weighed on every napkin fold and wine pour. In its place was something quieter, almost reverent. Conversations had dropped to murmurs. Laughter, once sharp and shallow, now softened into something real. The clatter of cutlery resumed, but even that sounded more human. Keanu sat back in his chair, fingers wrapped around a warm cup of black coffee. The tension in his shoulders had eased, though his eyes remained alert. The book he had earlier clutched like a shield now rested beside him, closed, spine up. Across the table, Morgan sat with his hands folded lightly in front of him, staring out the window as fields of green and gold rolled by in a blur. There was no need for words between them. The battle had already been fought, not with fists or shouting, but with presence, with truth. And the car, once a palace of silent hierarchies, had been recalibrated. At the far end of the aisle, a young man, early 20s, nervous but determined, rose from his seat. He held something in his hand, a phone, or perhaps a folded piece of paper. He hesitated near the end of the table, eyes darting from Keanu to Morgan. "Excuse me," the young man said quietly. Morgan turned, surprised but open. "My name's Jalen," he said. "I just wanted to say," my mom cried when she saw the video. "The one where you read Baldwin's letter. She's a teacher in Mississippi. She played it for her class, and she said it was the first time some of her students really understood what dignity meant." Morgan's eyes blinked slowly, not out of weariness this time, but to hold something back. He nodded, then offered a small smile. "She has good taste in literature," he replied. Jalen chuckled, but it caught in his throat. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to say thank you. Keanu gestured to the seat next to him. "You're welcome to sit," he said. Jalen looked around, as if to make sure he wasn't breaking some unspoken rule, then took the seat beside Keanu. The other guests watched quietly. There were no longer whispers of doubt or raised brows. Something had broken earlier, an invisible wall, and it wasn't just between Morgan and Regina. It had splintered across the entire car. The woman who had asked about the price of Morgan's coat now looked toward him with something like embarrassment in her gaze. A man who had earlier bragged about his penthouse was now nodding quietly, as if trying to align himself with a better version of the conversation. The car breathed in a different rhythm now, no longer dictated by dominance or decorum. It moved in quiet cadence with something deeper, humility, reflection, maybe even remorse. Morgan turned slightly in his seat, facing Jalen more fully. "What's your mother's name?" "Angela Wren," Jalen said. "She teaches 8th grade history. She's been using documentaries and speeches to show her students how history isn't just facts, but voices. She says your voice helped her classroom feel more human." Morgan's brow lifted slightly. "Angela Wren," he repeated. "That's a name I'll remember." From across the table, Keanu said softly, "Sometimes the smallest echoes carry the farthest." There was a quiet beat. Then Jalen reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "I wasn't sure if I should give this to you, but my mom wrote you a letter. She didn't know I'd end up on the same train. She just said, in case you ever meet him, tell him he reminded me that words still matter." Morgan took the envelope gently, as if it were glass. He didn't open it yet. He just held it, thumb brushing across the seal. The waiter approached their table with a quieter posture than before. No performance, no rehearsed pleasantries, just presence. "Would you like anything else, Mr. Freeman? Mr. Reeves?" he asked, not in a tone of obligation, but of respect. Keanu declined with a nod. Morgan asked for water, then paused. "And could you let the kitchen know the gumbo earlier had too much cayenne?" The waiter blinked, confused for half a second, then realized Morgan was joking. The old man gave a small grin, and the tension slipped even further from the room. A few at nearby tables laughed. It was subtle, but transformative. Humor hadn't existed earlier. There had been sarcasm, yes, pretension, disguised as cleverness, but now came real levity, rooted in warmth. At the other end of the car, a middle-aged woman looked toward Morgan and then slowly raised her wine glass in a quiet salute. She didn't say a word, but the gesture was unmistakable. Keanu noticed and gave her a soft nod in return. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It had become ceremonial. Jalen, still seated beside Keanu, leaned back slightly. "I always thought fame would make people bigger," he said. "But watching you two tonight, it kind of does the opposite. It makes everything else feel small." Morgan turned toward him, smiling gently. "Fame is a magnifier, son. If you're full of noise, it'll just make the noise louder. But if you've got something real inside you, something still and strong, it turns into a signal. And people who need that signal, they hear it. Keanu glanced out the window. Most people miss that part. They chase the volume, not the clarity. Jalen nodded. The train rumbled on. Then a surprising thing happened. One by one, a few passengers rose from their seats. Not in protest, in reverence. They didn't crowd or interrupt. They simply approached, offered a hand, or whispered a thank you as they passed. A woman placed a small notebook beside Morgan, pages filled with children's poems. A teenager handed Keanu a Polaroid and said, "You were my dad's favorite. No cameras, no spectacle, just something honest." Morgan leaned back, eyes scanning the car. "Funny thing about trains," he said quietly. "They don't change their destination, but the people riding them sure can." And for the first time that night, the whole car truly listened. The train hummed gently as it carved through open countryside, fields of golden grass brushing past in long, quiet waves. Inside the alien car, something had changed. Not a sound exactly, but a weight. As if the very air had adjusted its rhythm to the presence of stillness. People spoke in low tones now, if at all. Dishes were cleared without clatter. Phones stayed tucked away, forgotten for once. Morgan sat beside the window, his hands resting lightly on his knees. The sun glinted across his glasses, casting a soft sheen over the lenses. Keanu remained nearby, not close enough to invade the space, but near enough that their presence merged into a quiet companionship. No more eyes on them, no more hushed speculation. The car had finally stopped performing. Keanu leaned back in his seat, arms folded gently, gaze aimed at the window but not focused on it. There was a peace between them that didn't need words. It was the kind of peace born not from agreement, but from understanding. The kind that grows only when something has been broken, then made whole again, not by apology, but by truth. Morgan spoke first, his voice a low gravel softened by time. "Funny," he said, eyes still forward. "I've narrated kings, pharaohs, prophets, presidents. I've told the stories of men who built empires and those who burned them down, and still, I keep finding myself drawn back to this." He paused. Not for effect, but for space. To silence. Keanu's head turned just slightly, enough to catch the edge of Morgan's face and profile. "Sometimes silence is louder," he replied, almost a whisper. "It's what's left after everything true has been said." Morgan nodded slowly. He didn't speak again. Not right away. The two men sat there, shoulder to shoulder, not touching, not talking, yet saying more than an hour of dialogue ever could. A gentle rattle of the wheels over track changes reminded them both where they were hurtling forward, yet somehow, slowed by the weight of the moment. The train wasn't moving slower by speed, but by reverence. The alien car no longer felt like a space for transaction or status. It felt like a church without walls. A sanctuary in motion. At one table, a little girl colored quietly while her mother ran fingers through her curls. A middle-aged man, once constantly checking his watch, now simply looked out the window as if remembering something he'd nearly lost. Even Jameson, the steward, moved with a different energy, less polished, more human. The kind of grace that comes not from training, but from having witnessed a transformation and allowing it to settle in. Morgan turned slowly toward Keanu and offered a half smile, the kind that held pain and pride at once. "I used to think power was in the voice," he said, "in telling the story, shaping it." Keanu tilted his head, listening. "But maybe," Morgan continued, "real power is in knowing when to let the story tell itself." Keanu considered Morgan's words, letting them hang in the air. No rush to respond. No need to fill the space just because it was available. That was the old rhythm, the one people used when they were uncomfortable with quiet. But this silence, this one, had earned its place. "I think you did both," Keanu said finally, voice calm. "You shaped the story, but you also let it shape you." Morgan's smile deepened slightly, the lines around his mouth folding like old paper. "Maybe that's the only real way to tell one. Let it mark you." Outside, the hills had grown taller, greener. The sun crept behind a cloud, softening the light inside the train car. It cast a diffused glow on the table, the floor, their hands. A few seats away, someone coughed gently, but no one stirred. It wasn't the cough that mattered. It was the awareness that even interruptions now carried reverence. Morgan reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Not the grand envelope from earlier, but something more personal. A note, worn at the edges. He didn't open it, just ran his thumb across the crease. "My wife used to write me little notes before I'd leave for filming," he said. "Not paragraphs, just lines, sometimes a single sentence." Keanu turned his chair just slightly to face him. "What did this one say?" Morgan looked down at it but didn't unfold it. "Don't forget to see people, not just places." He exhaled, then tucked the note away. "She wrote that when I was doing a documentary on landscapes. She knew the temptation to let your eyes sweep past faces." Keanu nodded. "And yet today," he said, "you were the one people didn't see." Morgan met his gaze with a faint shrug. "Maybe that's the price of seeing clearly. You become invisible to those still looking through fog." Keanu leaned back, processing that. "I wonder how many people we pass every day who've carried the weight of the world, and we just keep walking." Morgan looked out the window, the scenery blurring. "That's why silence matters. It makes space to notice." Then something shifted, not in words, not in gesture, but in presence. Keanu didn't lean forward. He didn't say anything profound. But in that moment, he became more than a man sitting beside Morgan Freeman. He became a listener, a witness, a co-pilgrim on the train of memory, grief, and grace. The alien car rolled on, heading toward a destination no one would remember, but with a journey no one would forget. Morgan folded his hands again. "I think we spend half our lives trying to be heard," he said. "And the other half trying to remember what we meant." Keanu smiled softly. "And the best parts?" he asked. Morgan turned, that same weathered smile blooming once more. "They're in between." The silence returned, not because nothing was left to say, but because everything that mattered already had been. The train's rhythm had slowed. What was once a steady hum beneath the floorboards now carried a deliberate, gentle lull, like it too had something on its mind. The skyline of Chicago began to materialize in the distance, its outline softened by morning haze, as though the city itself were not quite ready to be fully seen. Inside the alien car, the atmosphere remained hushed. Passengers had shifted from conversation to contemplation. A few scrolled through their phones, others stared out the window, but most kept sneaking glances toward the two men seated near the center, no longer because they were famous, but because something had changed. Reverence had taken root, not in worship, but in witnessing something real unfold. Morgan began gathering his things with slow, unhurried motions. He folded the edges of a newspaper he hadn't read, slid his empty coffee cup to the side, and checked the pocket where the small note from his wife rested. Still there. Still safe. Keanu remained seated. His arms rested loosely on the table, his fingers lightly grazing the surface, as though following invisible threads. He had been quiet for some time, not because there was nothing to say, but because it wasn't time to say it yet. The train swayed gently as it approached the final curve into the station. Morgan looked up at the monitors overhead. Estimated arrival, 7 minutes. "That's always the strange part," he said softly. "You travel all this way, and then suddenly, it's done." Keanu nodded slowly. His voice was calm, measured. "Sometimes the arrival isn't the end, it's the echo." Morgan's lips curled into a thoughtful smile. He nodded, his eyes scanning the rows of passengers, each one somehow changed. You could see it in their posture. A bit more humility, a bit more quiet thought. Then Keanu reached into his backpack, one that had been by his feet the entire journey. From it, he pulled out a paperback book. Its cover was frayed, the corners bent, the spine was cracked from rereading, but it was clearly cared for. He slid it gently across the table toward Morgan. Morgan looked down at the cover, then back at Keanu. "The Brothers Karamazov," he murmured, touching the edge of the book with 2 fingers. "Dostoevsky. Chapter 4, Keanu said. "Marked it last week. I thought of you when I reread it." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "You thought of me before we met?" Keanu nodded. I guess. I thought of the kind of man I wanted to be. Morgan didn't speak right away. He flipped open the book, his thumb naturally finding the spot where a small torn movie ticket served as a bookmark. His eyes scanned the beginning lines of the chapter. Then he closed the book, quietly, reverently. You reminded me, Keanu said, that it's not about being noticed, it's about being present. Morgan let out a low breath. His voice dipped low, heavy with truth. Then something good came from something ugly. Keanu nodded once, firmly. Not the way people agree in polite conversation, but the kind of nod that settles something inside you. Across from him, Morgan gently slipped the worn book into the side pocket of his blazer. It didn't quite fit, and it bent the jacket awkwardly, but neither of them cared. The book had weight, not just in pages, but in memory now. Outside the window, the city stretched wider. The train slowed even more. A few people began rising from their seats, collecting bags, smoothing jackets. But in the Alean car, no one rushed. It was as if no one wanted to be the first to break the stillness that had fallen over them all. The young man who had spoken to Morgan earlier about his mother crying when she saw the video stood again. This time, he wasn't alone. A middle-aged woman in a forest green coat stepped forward with him. Her eyes were moist but bright, and her steps carried the hesitation of someone approaching a sacred place. Morgan looked up. She didn't speak right away. She just extended her hand. I just wanted to say thank you, she whispered, for what you said and for how you said it. Morgan didn't hesitate. He took her hand with both of his. Then I'll thank you in return, he said, for listening. Keanu stood now too. Not to interrupt, but as if to stand witness. The moment didn't belong to fame or reputation. It belonged to presence, to grace. The conductor's voice crackled faintly over the intercom, announcing their approach to Union Station. A ripple moved through the train. Somewhere, a baby cried. A man sneezed. The world resumed its background rhythm, but the sacredness in this car held a beat of its own. Regina sat near the back, still quiet. She hadn't said a word since the confrontation. Her phone rested in her lap, untouched. Her assistant sat beside her, clearly unsure whether to speak or remain still. Eventually, Regina did stand, but with none of the clipped confidence she'd worn when she boarded. Now, she looked smaller somehow. Not defeated, but disarmed. She walked toward the front of the car where Keanu and Morgan stood, and she paused just a few feet away. Her gaze didn't reach Morgan's eyes directly. She focused somewhere between them, on a space that had held her control, now gone. I misjudged everything, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. I thought I was leading a conversation, but I was, chasing relevance. Morgan tilted his head, and Keanu, silent beside him, didn't flinch. Regina turned to Keanu next. And you let me. Keanu met her eyes then. Sometimes people don't need to be corrected, he said. They need to be heard until they hear themselves. Regina nodded, almost imperceptibly. Then she left. Not in a rush, not in shame, just quietly. Her assistant followed, not knowing what to say, but knowing this wasn't the moment to fill with noise. A young girl, maybe 15, had watched the entire exchange. As Regina passed, she didn't shrink back like she had earlier. She stood a little straighter. Her gaze followed Morgan instead. Is it true, she asked softly, that you used to narrate stories to yourself just to feel less alone? Morgan smiled. It still works, she beamed. And in that small, spontaneous joy, something healed in the air. Keanu placed a gentle hand on Morgan's shoulder. Let's go. Morgan nodded once. Together they walked toward the light. Morgan Freeman sat still on the platform bench as the train pulled away. The city of Chicago was beginning to stir behind him, a backdrop of towers and traffic wrapped in soft dawn light. In his lap, the book Keanu had handed him rested lightly, the cover gently scuffed, the spine soft from years of reading. He opened it with care, finding the page marked with a folded corner and a handwritten note in the margin. It read simply, "This changed me once. I thought it might help you remember too." K. He looked to the top of the page. The chapter heading was faded but clear. Chapter 4. The lines were familiar, but they struck differently now. More than memory, they felt earned. And some men, when they choose to stand, make the whole room rise with them. Morgan exhaled. He could still hear the rhythm of the train echoing in his bones. Not just the wheels on track, but the silence that had grown between those seats, the kind that mended things quietly. He remembered the hush that had taken the Alean car after Regina's fall from grace. The stillness hadn't been imposed, it was offered and accepted. He traced his finger over the words. He thought of the many scripts he'd performed, the dozens of men he'd become on-screen: presidents, convicts, prophets, victims, villains. But none had demanded what that moment with Keanu had. Not performance, presence. The line of people who had begun to quietly shake his hand on the train. The barista who now knew his name. The child who had slipped a crayon sketch into his coat pocket. All of it silent, none of it requested, all of it given. That was what had risen. He didn't stand during the applause. He hadn't needed to, and neither had Keanu. The memory of Keanu's hand on his shoulder, light but grounding, returned to him now. It hadn't been theatrical, it had been steady. A gesture between men who had both carried something invisible through too many rooms where people only saw the surface. Looked around the station. No cameras followed him here. No flashes. Just a few passengers heading off to their early shifts. A couple watching a sleepy child attempt to balance a bag taller than he was. The train was gone now, swallowed by the west. But the moment wasn't. Morgan lifted the book again and reread the line. And some men, when they choose to stand, make the whole room rise with them. This time, he closed the book with both hands, not in finality, but in reverence. It wasn't about grand gestures. It never had been. It was about presence, and choosing to rise quietly, so others might too. He placed the book in the crook of his arm and began walking, not fast, not with purpose, just enough to let the morning find him. The train had moved on, but its lesson had not. Morgan walked through the station slowly, each step echoing softly against the polished tile. He moved like someone who wasn't in a rush anymore, like a man who had just let go of something heavy, something that had been clinging to his back for far too long. There was a subtle shift in him now. Not loud, not performative, just present. That same shift he had felt on the train car after Keanu spoke, the moment silence became a sanctuary instead of a weapon. Outside, the city had begun to wake in full. Streetlights blinked off, one by one, as sunlight poured through the glass canopies. People passed by, absorbed in their phones, their coffee, their to-do lists. And yet, a few recognized him. A nod here, a quiet double-take there, but no one stopped him. No one dared break the quiet he carried. He kept his hand on the book. It felt like a compass now, not a relic. That line, it had anchored something inside him. It was never about the spotlight. It was about whether you used it to warm others or blind them. Keanu had understood that. Always had. Morgan hadn't seen it before, not fully. He had admired Keanu's mystique like the rest of the world. His humility, his privacy, his paradox of being present while refusing the pull of fame. But now, after those quiet hours on the rails, he understood the why behind it. Keanu didn't just avoid spectacle, he rejected performance as a way of life. He wasn't acting humble, he simply chose not to center himself, so others might rise. That was the lesson. That was the room rising. Morgan paused at a bench just outside the station. He sat again, allowing the book to rest beside him. The streets were filling now. A delivery truck pulled into a loading dock. A jogger passed with her headphones in. Somewhere behind him, a coffee cart hissed with steam. But inside Morgan, there was only stillness. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen for a moment before unlocking it. Dozens of messages blinked to life agents, studio heads, morning shows, brand deals, streaming requests. He scrolled past them all. Then he opened a blank note. No title, no formatting, just a blinking cursor. And then, slowly, carefully, he typed, Sometimes the most important thing you'll ever say is nothing. He stared at the words. Then, he deleted them. He didn't need to post this. Didn't need to turn it into a quote card or a viral moment. Not everything had to be captured. Some truths could just be lived. He turned off the phone. Then he picked up the book again, letting his hand rest over the worn cover like someone might hold a door open, not for themselves, but for whoever came next. Morgan stood and walked to the edge of the platform. The train that had carried them now pulled west, slicing through the golden morning like a promise. He opened the book to chapter 4 again and read silently as the last car disappeared from view. The line echoed one more time. And some men, when they choose to stand, make the whole room rise with them. Morgan closed the book, not like an ending, but like a beginning. He smiled to himself. The train was gone, but the lesson stayed. And sometimes memory travels farther than steel ever could. What happened on that train wasn't about spilled wine or misplaced judgment. It wasn't about class seating or who sat where. It was about presence, about power, and most of all, about dignity. Morgan Freeman didn't need to defend himself with loud words or outraged gestures. He didn't need to raise his voice or make a scene. He simply endured. And in that silence, something powerful happened. The car shifted, energy shifted, perceptions cracked. It was the kind of shift that can only occur when a truth too long ignored finally rises to the surface. Because what really spilled that day wasn't just wine. It was illusion. The illusion that power always wears designer suits, that influence walks in heels and makes demands. That authority comes from titles, or ticket classes, or social media followers. No, real power often sits quietly, watching, listening, letting others reveal themselves, and Morgan let them. In the face of arrogance, he chose grace. In the face of insult, he chose silence. Not out of fear, but out of discipline. Dignity speaks without speaking. And Morgan Freeman has always known that some of the strongest messages are the ones never shouted. Keanu understood that too. He didn't rise because he was Keanu Reeves, global star. He rose because he saw what others refused to see. He saw a man being disrespected, a legend being diminished, and he knew that to remain seated, to say nothing, would make him complicit in that injustice. So he stood. He didn't give a speech. He didn't yell. He just changed where he stood physically and morally. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that silence is never neutral. You're either holding the line or you're letting it slip. When Keanu offered his seat, it wasn't just about hospitality. It was about alignment. A quiet declaration. I see you, and I refuse to let you be invisible. Because sometimes, the loudest thing you can do is act. That moment, on the train, rippled across every car, and later, across the internet. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. Because everyone, at some point, has watched someone be treated unfairly and wondered, should I say something? Should I do something? This time, someone did, and that's what made it unforgettable. The train eventually reached its destination. People disembarked. Life went on, but something had shifted in everyone who witnessed it. Not just in how they viewed Morgan Freeman or Keanu Reeves or even themselves, but in how they understood what it means to show up not for attention, but for principle. The world is full of opportunities to stay seated, to scroll past, to remain comfortable in silence. But every so often, a moment invites you to rise, not for applause, not for recognition, but because it's right. That's the kind of moment that defines character. Morgan didn't ask for anyone to stand up for him. He didn't demand respect. But when it was given freely, without condition, something unspoken passed between two men who had spent decades navigating fame, failure, and everything in between. One stood, the other nodded. No speeches, just mutual understanding. And what's remarkable is that the impact didn't end on that train. It rippled into living rooms, phones, dinner tables. It sparked conversations. People didn't just share the video, they reflected on it, quietly, thoughtfully. because we all know what it feels like to be overlooked. We've all sat somewhere, hoping someone would notice that something wasn't right. And maybe you've been Keanu too, watching something unfold, heart-pounding, wondering if your action would matter, if standing up would change anything. This story says it does. It reminds us that heroism isn't reserved for grand gestures or breaking news headlines. Sometimes, it's just one person refusing to look away, one seat offered, one silence broken, one dignity restored. Morgan later said the train ride taught him something about the world that no film set ever did. That the world is still listening even when it pretends not to. That actions echo, and that even in a cynical age, truth has weight. He also admitted that for a long time he had grown tired of being the voice, of always being asked to speak the wisdom, narrate the lesson. But on that train, he didn't have to say anything, because someone else said it for him with a gesture. And maybe that's the lesson. Maybe the best way to honor those who've carried the weight of history on their backs is not just to listen to their stories, but to act when their presence is challenged. It doesn't have to be on a train. It could be in a hallway, in a classroom, in a meeting, at a family table, when someone is being diminished, when arrogance fills the air, when power is being used to dismiss instead of uplift. That's when we are called to stand. Keanu stood, and it changed more than a moment. It changed the room. It reminded everyone watching that humility is not weakness, and silence is not submission. It showed that there's still space in this world for quiet courage, for decency, for men who lift others instead of stepping over them. And if that story moved you, maybe it's because deep down, you believe the same thing. That we can do better, that we can be better, that the world is shaped not by those who speak the loudest, but by those who stand when no one's watching. So now it's your turn. Have you ever stood up when it mattered? Or did someone stand up for you when you least expected it? Share your incredible story in the comments. We read every single one. And if this moment between Morgan and Keanu stirred something in you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more incredible stories that remind us who we are and who we can become. Sometimes, the world changes not with a shout, but with a quiet choice to do the right thing, even when no one's watching.